Imagine standing at the edge of a windswept Icelandic coastline as winter descends upon the land. The sun, already weak and reluctant, dips below the horizon far earlier than it should, plunging the world into a darkness that feels alive, hungry, and ancient. The air carries the scent of salt and cold stone, and in the distance, rising from the frost-covered earth like the broken teeth of giants, stand the burial mounds. These are not mere hills shaped by wind and time. They are chambers of the dead, constructed with deliberate care by hands that understood something fundamental about the boundary between this world and the next. Within each mound lies a warrior, a chieftain, perhaps even a king, surrounded by the treasures they refuse to leave behind. Swords with hilts wrapped in silver, arm rings of twisted gold, shields painted with the symbols of their lineage, and coins meant to pay for passage to realms unknown. The Norse people who built these mounds and laid their dead within them understood a truth that modern civilization has largely forgotten. Death was not an ending, but a threshold, a doorway standing perpetually ajar between the world of the living and the vast, unknowable territories beyond. This liminal space, thin as spider silk yet strong as iron, could be crossed in both directions under the right circumstances. The dead could return, and when they did, they brought with them powers that defied every natural law. In the sagas of medieval Iceland and Scandinavia, this return was not metaphorical. It was documented with the same matter-of-fact precision used to record marriages, land disputes, and voyages across treacherous seas. The chronicles speak of corpses that refused to remain still, of the deceased who rose from their graves with purpose, intelligence, and a terrifying awareness of who they had been in life. These were not shambling, mindless creatures driven by base hunger. They were the Draugr, the undead warriors of the north, and they remembered everything. Before we go further into this darkness together, before we open the burial mound and face what lies within, I need you to do something. If you are drawn to the shadows where history and horror intertwine, if you crave stories that are rooted not in Hollywood imagination, but in the genuine fears and beliefs of ancient peoples, then subscribe to this channel right now. The tales we uncover here are not for the casual observer. They demand your full attention, your willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth that our ancestors lived in a world far stranger and more dangerous than we can easily comprehend. Hit that notification bell, because the myths we explore will challenge everything you think you know about the undead, and you will not want to miss a single chapter of this journey into the frozen heart of Norse terror. Now, let us return to those burial mounds standing silent against the Icelandic sky. Picture yourself approaching one as twilight deepens into true night. The mound is older than any living memory, constructed in an age when the Christian cross had not yet reached these northern shores, when the old gods still demanded blood and poetry in equal measure. Grass grows thick upon its rounded surface, and stones mark its perimeter like a circle of guardians. There is no door visible, no obvious entrance, yet you know with absolute certainty that something waits within. The Vikings who interred their dead in such places followed rituals that were both practical and profoundly symbolic. The body was dressed in finest garments, armed as if preparing for battle, and surrounded by objects of power and wealth. Horses were sometimes slaughtered and buried alongside their masters. Slaves, in the darkest traditions, might be sent to accompany a lord into death. All of this was preparation, not for an eternal sleep, but for a continued existence in another form, another realm. But something could go wrong in this carefully orchestrated transition. a warrior who died with unfinished business, consumed by greed for the gold buried with him, or filled with rage at enemies left unpunished, might refuse to make the journey to the halls of the dead. Instead, he would remain, anchored to his corpse and his treasure, transforming into something that was neither fully dead nor remotely alive. The Draugr was born from this refusal, this stubborn clinging to the material world, even as the body began its inevitable decay. The sagas describe these beings with a specificity that is deeply unsettling. They are not vague spirits or transparent ghosts. They are corporeal, physical, and grotesquely changed by whatever force animates them. The Icelandic writers who documented these encounters did so with a historian's eye for detail, recording heights, behaviors, and the exact methods required to stop them. These were not campfire tales meant to frighten children. They were warnings, instructions, and acknowledgments of a genuine terror that stalked the settlements of the north. Consider the landscape that gave birth to these legends. Medieval Iceland was a place of profound isolation, where farmsteads stood separated by vast stretches of volcanic rock, black sand beaches, and treacherous mountain passes. Winter brought darkness that lasted for months, a cold so intense it could kill an unprepared traveler in hours, and storms that seemed to carry the wrath of angry gods. In such an environment, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural became impossibly thin. The people who lived in this harsh world developed a complex relationship with their dead. Ancestors were honored, their graves tended, their memories preserved in poetry and saga. But they were also feared, particularly those who had been powerful, wealthy, or cruel in life. The mounds that dotted the landscape were approached with caution, respected as sacred spaces, and avoided after dark. To disturb a burial mound was to invite catastrophe, for the guardian within would not tolerate intrusion. Yet treasure calls to the greedy and the desperate. Throughout the sagas, we find accounts of men who dared to break into these ancient graves, driven by the lure of gold and weapons forged by master craftsmen long dead. Some succeeded, fleeing with their plunder into the night. Others were not so fortunate. They encountered the mound's occupant, awakened and enraged. And what followed was a struggle not merely for treasure, but for survival itself. The Draugr that emerged from these mounds were not random monsters. Each retained the personality, the skills, and the motivations that had defined them in life. A warrior known for his strength would possess even greater power in death. A king obsessed with his hoard would guard it with supernatural fury. A man who died seeking revenge would pursue his enemies beyond the grave, relentless and unstoppable. This retention of identity, of self, is what separates the Draugr from every modern conception of the zombie or revenant. As we stand here at the threshold of this exploration, gazing across the darkening landscape of medieval Scandinavia with its sentinel mounds and its terrible secrets, we must understand that we are not entering a world of simple horror. We are stepping into a complex mythology where death is transformation, where the physical and the spiritual intertwine, and where the rules governing existence are fundamentally different from those we take for granted. The Draugr waits within his mound, patient and eternal, and in the chapters to come, we will learn exactly what he has become. To understand the Draugr, you must first understand how the Vikings buried their dead. This was not a simple matter of digging a hole and offering prayers for the departed soul. Viking burial was theater, ritual, and investment, all woven together into a complex ceremony that reflected the deceased's status, wealth, and expectations for what lay beyond death. The graves they constructed were not meant to be final resting places, but rather chambers of transition, armories for an eternal existence, and in some tragic cases, prisons that could not hold their occupants. When a warrior of significant standing died, his community would gather to prepare him for a journey that everyone understood he would actually undertake. The body was washed and dressed in the finest garments available, often clothing that had been specially woven or reserved for this exact purpose. His weapons were placed alongside him: the sword that had tasted blood in a dozen battles, the axe that had split shields and helms, the spear that bore his personal marks. These were not symbolic gestures. The Vikings believed with absolute conviction that these items would accompany the warrior into whatever realm awaited him. But the preparation did not end with arms and armor. Gold was added to the grave, arm rings that had been awarded for valor, coins from distant lands acquired through trade or raid, brooches worked with intricate designs that represented entire family lineages. Silver followed gold, heaped around the body in quantities that would have made the deceased a wealthy man had he chosen to spend it in life. Practical items joined the precious: drinking horns, gaming pieces, tools for craft work, even ships in the case of the most powerful chieftains. The message was clear. This warrior was taking his wealth with him, and he would arrive in the afterlife as a man of substance and power. The mound itself was constructed with deliberate care, stones arranged in specific patterns, earth piled high enough to be visible from great distances. These structures dominated the landscape, serving as constant reminders to the living that the dead remained present, watching, and in some sense still participating in the community's life. To pass by a burial mound was to acknowledge the person within, to remember their deeds, and to respect the space they now occupied between worlds. In the ideal circumstance, the warrior's spirit would depart for Valhalla if he had died well in battle, or to Hell's realm if death had found him in less glorious circumstances. The body would remain in the mound, slowly returning to the earth while the treasures corroded and the weapons rusted into fragments. The mound would become part of the landscape's history, a place of ancestral memory but not active threat. This was the hoped-for outcome, the natural progression from life through death into whatever existence followed. But not every warrior could let go. Not every chieftain was ready to surrender his gold and his dominion over the living. And it was in these failures of transition, these refusals to accept death's finality, that the Draugr came into being. Imagine dying with your mind consumed by the treasure buried beside you, unable to release your grip on wealth even as your heart stops beating. Picture leaving life with vengeance burning in your thoughts, enemies still walking free, insults still unavenged. Consider the possibility that your attachment to power, to your hall, to your reputation, might prove stronger than death itself. The sagas record what happened in such cases with unsettling consistency. The body did not remain peacefully in its mound. Instead, something animated it from within, filling dead flesh with unholy vitality and purpose. The warrior rose, but he rose changed, transformed into a being that retained his intelligence, his memories, and his motivations while gaining powers that no living man could possess. This was the birth of the Draugr, and it was a birth that communities learned to dread above almost any other supernatural threat. You must understand how profoundly different this makes the Draugr from the shambling corpses of modern zombie fiction. When George Romero's Undead rise, they are driven by mindless hunger, blank vessels animated by biological compulsion. They do not remember their names, their families, or their former lives. They cannot plan, strategize, or hold grudges. They simply consume, an endless appetite given rotting form. The Draugr retained everything. He knew who he had been. He remembered his enemies by name and face. He could speak, threaten, curse, and bargain. His intelligence was not diminished by death, but rather seemed to sharpen, focused entirely on his obsessions and no longer distracted by the needs and weaknesses of living flesh. This cognitive retention manifested in terrifying ways. A Draugr who had been a skilled warrior in life would use those same tactics in death, wielding his burial weapons with the expertise gained through years of training and battle. He would not flail wildly, but would strike with precision, using the terrain of his mound to advantage, setting ambushes for those foolish enough to seek his treasure. His personality remained intact as well, meaning that a cruel man in life became a cruel monster in death, while a warrior known for his cunning would employ that same treacherous intelligence to torment the living. The motivations that drove Draugr were achingly human, despite the supernatural of their existence. Greed dominated many of them, an attachment to gold and silver so powerful it anchored their spirits to rotting flesh. These Draugr would not leave their mounds, but would wait with infinite patience for grave robbers, treasure seekers, and the merely curious. When such victims arrived, the Draugr would attack with focused brutality, not from hunger, but from possessive rage. The treasure was his, earned in life through violence and valor, and no living thief would take it while any fragment of his will remained to resist. Vengeance motivated others. The sagas speak of Draugr, who emerged from their graves to hunt down specific individuals, traveling considerable distances to reach those who had wronged them. These creatures would stalk their prey with methodical determination, immune to exhaustion, unbothered by cold or darkness, relentless in a way that no living pursuer could match. They remembered slights from life, feuds left unresolved, oaths broken, and they returned to collect payment with interest compounded by their newfound supernatural abilities. Some Draugr seemed driven by nothing more complex than malevolence itself, a generalized hatred for the living that expressed itself through random attacks, the spreading of disease, and the cursing of land and livestock. These were often men who had died angry, bitter individuals whose resentment of life itself transformed into a desire to make existence unbearable for those still drawing breath. They would emerge on dark nights to strangle sleeping victims, to drive cattle mad, to spoil milk and grain, to bring misfortune to any household unfortunate enough to be within reach of their mound. The Icelandic sagas that preserve these accounts were written by educated men, often Christian monks or scholars who had access to older oral traditions. These writers recorded Draugr encounters with the same seriousness they applied to historical events, legal disputes, and genealogies. They named names, described locations with geographic precision, and detailed the methods used to combat these threats. This documentary approach lends the accounts a weight that pure folklore often lacks. These were not fairy tales meant to entertain, but rather chronicles of what the community believed had genuinely occurred. Two sagas in particular stand out for their detailed treatment of Draugr encounters, and we will explore both in depth as we continue this journey. Grettis' saga tells of Glámr, a shepherd whose unpleasant personality in life became magnified into monstrous evil in death, and of the hero Grettir's desperate struggle against him. Eyrbyggja's saga recounts the story of Þorbjörn, whose death sparked a wave of supernatural terror that threatened to consume an entire settlement. These accounts will reveal the true horror of facing a Draugr. Not a mindless monster, but an intelligent, motivated, supernaturally powerful adversary who knows exactly what he wants and will destroy anything standing between him and his obsessions. As we prepare to examine these creatures in greater detail, to explore their grotesque transformations and terrifying abilities, Remember that we are not discussing Hollywood inventions or modern gaming enemies loosely inspired by Norse themes. We are confronting the genuine mythology of a warrior culture that took the undead seriously, that developed specific rituals and methods to combat them, and that recorded their encounters with a historian's precision. The Draugr was real to the Vikings, as real as storms and wolves and enemy raiders, and understanding that belief is essential to grasping the true depth of this Nordic nightmare. The transformation from warrior to Draugr does not occur in an instant. It is a process that unfolds within the sealed darkness of the burial mound, hidden from living eyes, witnessed only by the stones and the earth and the treasures piled around the corpse. What happens in that lightless chamber during the days and weeks following interment is a corruption that operates according to laws utterly alien to natural decay. A metamorphosis that transforms dead flesh into something that should not exist, yet does, horribly and completely. In a normal death, the body begins its return to the earth immediately. Cells break down, bacteria multiply, tissues soften and collapse. The process is gradual, inevitable, and ultimately thorough. Within the burial mound, however, something interrupts this natural progression. When the conditions align, when the warrior's attachment to his treasure or his vengeance or his very existence proves strong enough to anchor his will to his corpse, a different transformation begins. The flesh does not simply decay, it changes. The first sign of this unnatural alteration would be invisible to any observer, occurring at a level beyond sight. The body, which should be cooling and stiffening in the hours after death, remains somehow vital. Warmth persists where none should exist. The muscles, rather than entering rigor mortis and then relaxing into permanent stillness, retain a terrible tension. It is as if the corpse refuses to acknowledge its own death, clinging to animation through sheer force of stubborn will. As days pass within the mound, the physical changes become more pronounced and more grotesque. The body begins to swell, not with the gases of normal decomposition, but with something else entirely. The flesh expands, bloating outward until the corpse grows larger than it was in life. Arms thicken with unnatural mass, the torso distends, becoming barrel-like. Legs lengthen and broaden. The transformation continues relentlessly until the body that was buried at perhaps the height of 6 feet now measures 7, then 8, then larger still. The sagas speak of Draugr, whose size became truly monstrous. Creatures who had to crouch within their own burial chambers because they had outgrown the space constructed to contain them. This increase in size is not mere swelling, but represents a fundamental alteration of the body's structure. The Draugr gains genuine mass and substance, becoming not just larger, but heavier, denser, more solid. When such a creature moves, the earth trembles beneath its weight. When it strikes, the force behind the blow can shatter shields and break bones with contemptuous ease. The superhuman strength that defines the Draugr in combat is rooted in this physical transformation, this impossible augmentation of dead tissue into something far more formidable than living muscle could ever achieve. The skin undergoes its own horrifying metamorphosis. The natural pallor of death deepens and darkens, shifting through shades of gray and purple until it settles into a distinctive blue-black coloration. This is not the simple discoloration of a drowned corpse or the lividity of blood pooling in dead flesh. It is a uniform, unnatural darkness that speaks of corruption operating at the deepest level. The skin takes on a quality that witnesses describe with revulsion, appearing simultaneously leathery and swollen. tough enough to turn aside a carelessly aimed blade, yet distended with the pressure of whatever force animates the creature from within. The face, which in life might have been noble or at least recognizable, becomes a mask of horror. Features distort as the flesh swells and darkens. The nose flattens or protrudes at unnatural angles. The mouth stretches, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seem too large, too prominent, lending the Draugr's expression a permanent snarl even in repose. But it is the eyes that complete the transformation from corpse to monster. Where death should have left them dull and filmed over, they instead take on an eerie luminescence. The sagas describe Draugr eyes as glowing with a pale, cold light, like frost reflecting moonlight or the gleam of a predator's gaze caught in firelight. These eyes convey intelligence, malevolence, and an awareness that no dead thing should possess. The stench that emanates from a Draugr is another aspect of the transformation that defies natural explanation. Normal decomposition produces smells that are organic, however unpleasant. The odor of a Draugr is something else entirely. Witnesses who survived encounters with these creatures describe a reek so powerful and so wrong that it seems to have physical weight, pressing against the face like a rotten cloth. It is the smell of earth and mold and ancient corruption, mixed with something metallic and something worse that language struggles to capture. This stench precedes the Draugr when it moves, announcing its presence and sending waves of nausea through any living thing unfortunate enough to breathe it in. Yet for all these physical horrors, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Draugr transformation is what it does not change. The creature retains its face, however distorted. Its armor still fits, adjusted by that same supernatural alteration that increases the body's size. Its weapons remain in its grasp, familiar tools wielded with remembered skill. Most importantly, its mind remains intact behind those glowing eyes. The Draugr knows who it was. It remembers its name, its lineage, its deeds in life. This continuity of identity trapped within a corrupted shell is what separates these Norse undead from every lesser form of walking corpse. The transformation also grants the Draugr its supernatural resilience. Living flesh is vulnerable, easily pierced by sharp iron, broken by blunt force, torn by determined assault. The altered tissue of the Draugr resists damage in ways that defy understanding. Swords that should cleave through flesh and bone instead glance off or penetrate only shallowly. Spears that would kill any living warrior merely wound the Draugr, and even these wounds do not bleed properly or slow the creature's assault. This near invulnerability, combined with strength far exceeding that of any mortal man, makes combat with a Draugr an act of desperate heroism or suicidal foolishness, depending on the warrior's skill and luck. Inside the burial mound, as these changes progress, the Draugr becomes aware. Its eyes open in the absolute darkness. Its lungs, which should be still, draw breath not from need, but from some dark mimicry of life. It feels the weight of earth above it, the presence of treasure surrounding it, the boundaries of its tomb, and it waits. Time means nothing to the undead. Days and years pass in the black silence of the mound, while the Draugr sits with its gold and its weapons. Patient as only something that has already died can be patient. It listens for the sound of intruders, of footsteps above, of tools striking stone as grave robbers begin their work. When those sounds finally come, the Draugr rises, and what emerges from the mound is no longer the man who was buried, but something far more terrible. The transformation is complete. The warrior who entered death as a human being has become a Draugr, a creature of supernatural power and malevolent intelligence. bound to its treasure and its tomb by chains of greed or vengeance that even death could not break. The physical corruption of the corpse reflects the spiritual corruption that animated it, the refusal to let go, manifesting as a grotesque parody of life that can never truly live, but also cannot be easily destroyed. This is the birth of the terror that haunted medieval Scandinavia. And understanding the hideous process that creates it makes the threat all the more chilling. The Draugr was once a man, but the thing that guards the mound now is something else entirely. Something that remembers being human while existing as a monument to everything that can go wrong when death is not accepted as final. You stand at the entrance to a violated burial mound. The stones that once sealed it have been pried away by someone foolish or desperate enough to seek the treasure within. The opening yawns before you, like a mouth leading into absolute darkness. And from that darkness comes a smell so powerful, it makes your eyes water and your stomach revolt. This is your first warning that what waits inside is not merely a corpse, but something that has transcended death without achieving any state that could be called life. This is the scent of the Draugr, and it announces the creature's presence long before you see the horror of its form. Step closer if you dare. Peer into that darkness and wait for your eyes to adjust. There, in the depths of the mound, something moves. At first, it appears to be shadow separating from shadow, but then the shape resolves into something more defined, more terrible. You see the outline of a figure far larger than any man, hunched beneath the low ceiling of the burial chamber. And as it shifts position, you hear the scrape of armor against stone, and the wet, heavy sound of unnatural breath drawn through corrupted lungs. The Draugr is aware of your presence, and it is rising to meet the intrusion. The first detail that becomes clear is the sheer size of the thing. The warrior who was buried here might have stood 6 feet tall in life, a respectable height for a Viking of his era. The creature that has replaced him towers at least 8 feet, perhaps more, its bulk filling the chamber in a way that seems impossible given the dimensions of the space. The body has not merely swollen, but has somehow gained genuine mass and substance, as if the same dark force that animates it has also fed it, fattening the corpse with supernatural matter until it became this grotesque giant. Every dimension has increased proportionally, creating a figure that is recognizably humanoid, yet utterly wrong in its scale. The armor it wears has somehow expanded with the body, though whether this is another aspect of the supernatural transformation or whether the Draugr possesses the intelligence to refit its own equipment remains unclear. Regardless, the effect is chilling. The mail shirt that once protected a living warrior now encases this monstrous form. The iron rings stretch tight over the bloated torso. The helmet, pushed up slightly by the swelling of the skull beneath, sits at an angle that makes the creature appear even more inhuman. Leather straps and fastenings that should have rotted away remain intact, preserved by the same dark power that sustains the corpse itself. As the Draugr moves fully into what little light penetrates the mound, you see the true horror of its flesh. The skin has taken on a color that exists nowhere in the natural spectrum of living or normally dead tissue. It is a deep, uniform blue-black, the shade of deep bruising spread across every visible inch of the body. This is not the purple gray of a fresh corpse or the mottled discoloration of advanced decay. It is something else entirely, a darkness that seems to emanate from within the flesh itself, as if the corruption has stained the body at a fundamental level. The texture appears simultaneously leathery and swollen, tough enough to resist casual damage, yet distended with internal pressure. The face is perhaps the most disturbing element of the Draugr's appearance, because it retains just enough humanity to be recognizable, while being utterly transformed into something monstrous. The basic structure remains. The placement of eyes, nose, and mouth follows the human template. But every feature has been distorted by the swelling and darkening of the flesh. The nose might be flattened against the face or grotesquely enlarged. The cheeks bulge outward, pushing the eyes into deeper sockets. The jaw appears too large, the mouth too wide, as if the skull itself has expanded along with the soft tissue that covers it. But nothing prepares you for the eyes. They should be filmed over with death, dull and unseeing like those of any corpse left to rest in the ground. Instead, they gleam with a cold, pale light that has no natural source. The color is often described as a sickly blue-white, like moonlight filtered through ice, or sometimes as a dim red glow like coals that refuse to fully die. These eyes track movement with predatory focus. They convey intelligence, awareness, and an emotion that might be rage or hatred or simple territorial aggression. When the Draugr's gaze fixes upon you, there is no mistaking that you are being seen, evaluated, and judged as a threat to be eliminated. The hands that grip the ancient weapons are another study in grotesque transformation. Fingers have thickened into appendages more like clubs than digits, yet they retain the dexterity needed to wield sword and axe with deadly precision. The nails have continued growing in death, as folklore claims they do, becoming thick, yellowed talons that curve slightly at the tips. These hands possess strength far beyond what any living man could achieve, capable of crushing bone with casual pressure, of tearing shields apart, of lifting weights that would require multiple normal men to move. The sagas speak of Draugr lifting horses, throwing boulders, and breaking through walls with their bare hands. The stench that surrounds the Draugr deserves its own examination because it is not merely an unpleasant odor, but a weapon in its own right. This is not the simple smell of decomposition, though that element is certainly present. It is a complex reek that seems to have been designed by malevolent intelligence to assault every sense at once. There is the scent of earth, thick and choking, as if the grave itself clings to the creature. There is the smell of mold and rot, suggesting organic matter breaking down in damp darkness. But underneath these somewhat familiar odors lurks something else. A metallic tang mixed with a sweetness that is utterly wrong. A combination that triggers instinctive revulsion in anyone exposed to it. Warriors who survived encounters with Draugr reported that the smell lingered in their nostrils for days, that it clung to their clothing and equipment, and that it invaded their dreams with its wrongness. The Draugr's movement completes the portrait of supernatural horror. It does not shamble or stumble like a mindless corpse. Despite its size and the apparent bulk of its transformed body, it moves with purpose and coordination. When it walks, the ground trembles slightly beneath its weight. When it strikes, the blow comes with the speed of a trained warrior, combined with strength that can shatter shields on first contact. There is no clumsiness here, no loss of motor control. The creature retains all the combat skills it possessed in life, enhanced by its new physical capabilities and unconstrained by mortal limitations like fatigue or pain. The armor and weapons the Draugr carries are not merely decorative or symbolic. The sword gripped in those massive hands is a real weapon, forged by a master smith perhaps generations before, buried with its owner as a sign of status and martial prowess. That it remains functional after years or decades in the ground is another testament to the supernatural preservation that extends to everything associated with the creature. The blade may be tarnished, the edge may show signs of corrosion, but when the Draugr swings that sword, it cuts with lethal efficiency. The same applies to axes, spears, and any other weapons entombed with the warrior. They are tools of death in the hands of something that understands death intimately because it exists in that state perpetually. Some accounts mention additional horrifying details. The mouth, when opened, reveals teeth that seem too prominent, perhaps because the gums have receded or perhaps because they have grown in death like the fingernails. The voice, if the Draugr chooses to speak, emerges as a rasping, hollow sound, like wind through a cave or the scraping of stone on stone. The breath itself is visible sometimes, described as a gray mist that carries the creature's stench and seems to sap the strength of anyone who inhales it. These details vary between accounts, but they all contribute to the same conclusion. The Draugr is a comprehensive assault on every human sense, designed whether intentionally or by dark accident to inspire maximum revulsion and terror. This, then, is the anatomy of the Draugr as preserved in the Icelandic sagas and the collective memory of Norse culture. It is not a vague spirit or a metaphorical representation of death. It is a specific, physical, horrifyingly detailed creature with consistent characteristics across multiple independent accounts. The bloated blue-black body of immense size, the glowing eyes that track the living with predatory intelligence, the preserved armor and functional weapons, the overwhelming stench that precedes and surrounds it, the supernatural strength and retained combat skills. Every element combines to create something that stands as one of the most terrifying undead creatures in any cultural mythology, made all the more frightening by the matter-of-fact way the sagas describe it. This is what emerges from the burial mound. This is what guards the gold and seeks vengeance on the living. This is the Draugr in its full, terrible glory. The physical horror of the Draugr, its bloated blue-black corpse and glowing eyes, would be terrifying enough if that were the extent of its capabilities. But the Norse understanding of these creatures included powers that elevated them far beyond mere animated corpses into the realm of true supernatural nightmares. Among the most disturbing and tactically devastating of these abilities was the Draugr's mastery over its own form, its capacity to change both shape and size at will, transforming from one threat into another, with a fluidity that made any encounter with these undead warriors an exercise in constant, escalating dread. Imagine tracking a Draugr through the Icelandic wilderness. You followed it from its violated burial mound, determined to end the threat it poses to nearby settlements. The trail is clear at first. Massive footprints press deep into the volcanic soil, each step heavy enough to crack stone. You follow these tracks for hours, moving cautiously through valleys and over ridges, always aware that you are hunting something far more dangerous than you. Then, without warning, the footprints vanish. Not gradually, not becoming lighter or harder to follow, but simply ceasing to exist in the middle of open ground where nothing could have hidden the creature. You scan the landscape frantically, searching for your quarry, and see only a gray bull standing motionless on a distant hillside, watching you with eyes that gleam with cold, pale light. The shape-shifting ability of the Draugr is documented across multiple sagas with remarkable consistency. These creatures could transform themselves into various animal forms, each chosen for specific tactical advantages. The gray bull was a favored form, allowing the Draugr to appear as a natural part of the landscape while retaining much of its supernatural strength. A bull could charge with devastating force, its horns becoming weapons as deadly as any sword. More importantly, a bull aroused less immediate alarm than a 9-foot corpse warrior, allowing the Draugr to approach potential victims or observe them without triggering instant flight. Seals represented another common transformation. particularly useful for Draugr, whose burial mounds lay near coastal areas. Imagine fishing from your boat in the cold waters off Iceland's shore, hauling in your nets as the sun begins its early descent toward the horizon. A seal surfaces nearby, a common enough sight in these waters. You pay it little attention, focused on your work. But the seal does not dive again. It circles your boat with unnatural persistence, its movements too deliberate, its attention too focused. When it finally hauls itself onto a nearby rock, you see its eyes reflecting the dimming light with a glow that seals do not possess. And you realize with crawling horror that you are being hunted by something wearing a seal's form as a disguise. The transformation into a giant cat is mentioned in several accounts, though the specific type of feline varies between tellings. These were not ordinary cats enlarged to human size, but massive creatures, described as being the size of oxen, with all the predatory instinct and stealth that felines possess naturally. A Draugr in cat form could move with silent grace despite its enormous bulk, stalking its prey through darkness with eyes that tracked movement with perfect precision. The psychological impact of being hunted by such a creature, knowing that somewhere in the night a cat the size of a horse was closing in with supernatural patience, would have been devastating to Viking-age communities already hyper-aware of threats lurking in the darkness. But perhaps most disturbing was the Draugr's ability to transform into mist or fog, becoming essentially incorporeal while retaining its awareness and intent. Picture yourself barricaded inside a hall, doors barred and windows shuttered, believing yourself safe from the Draugr that has terrorized your settlement. The night is dark and a fog has rolled in from the sea, thick enough that you cannot see more than a few feet beyond your walls. You hear nothing, no footsteps, no breaking of wood, no sounds of assault. Yet gradually, impossibly, the fog begins to seep through the cracks in your defenses, flowing under doors and between boards like water. The temperature drops. The stench of the grave fills the confined space. And then, in the center of your hall, the fog begins to coalesce, to take shape, and the Draugr stands before you having bypassed every physical barrier you erected against it. The tactical implications of these transformations were profound. A creature that could change its form was nearly impossible to track consistently or trap effectively. Warriors who thought they had cornered a Draugr in its mound might find themselves facing a bull that charged through their formation, scattering armed men like chaff. Hunters who wounded what they believed was a seal might watch in horror as it transformed on the shore into a towering undead warrior who could not be killed by the wounds that would have finished any natural animal. The unpredictability of the Draugr's form meant that any encounter required constant vigilance and the willingness to fight whatever shape the creature chose to adopt. But shape-shifting was only one aspect of the Draugr's mastery over form. Even more terrifying was its ability to alter its size at will, growing to monstrous proportions that made combat nearly impossible, or shrinking to dimensions that allowed it to pursue victims through spaces that should have offered safety. The sagas describe this ability with vivid detail, emphasizing how the Draugr could swell until its bulk filled entire rooms, its head scraping against ceiling beams, its shoulders too wide to fit through doorways it had entered moments before at normal size. Consider the tactical nightmare this presented. You face a Draugr in combat, your sword ready, your shield positioned to deflect its attacks. The creature stands perhaps 8 feet tall, already larger than any living man, but still within the realm of something you might theoretically fight. You strike, your blade connecting with its arm. The Draugr does not fall back or retreat. Instead, it grows. In seconds, it looms 10 feet tall, then 12, then larger still. Your sword, which moments ago might have reached its chest, now barely scratches its knees. The ceiling of the hall strains under the pressure of its expanding bulk. Timber cracks. Stone grinds against stone. And you realize with absolute certainty that you are not fighting a creature bound by any physical laws you understand. The ability to shrink presented equally horrifying possibilities. Draugr could reduce their size to squeeze through openings that should have been impassable, allowing them to invade homes through windows barely wide enough for a child, or to follow fleeing victims into narrow caves and crevices where humans sought shelter, believing themselves unreachable. The psychological impact of knowing that no space was too small to offer protection from these creatures cannot be overstated. Every crack in a wall, every gap beneath a door, every hole in the roof became a potential entry point for a monster that could compress its bulk to fit through impossibly tight spaces before expanding again to its full, terrible size once inside. Some accounts suggest that the size changes were not always voluntary or controlled, but could occur in response to the Draugr's emotional state. A creature consumed by rage might swell involuntarily, its fury manifesting as literal physical expansion. One filled with cunning and focused on infiltration might find itself naturally shrinking to facilitate its goals. This possibility, that the transformations reflected the Draugr's inner state, adds another layer of horror to the mythology. The creatures were not simply using powers mechanically, but were so deeply supernatural that their very substance responded to their thoughts and emotions, reality bending around their will. The combination of shape-shifting and size manipulation made the Draugr perhaps the most adaptable supernatural threat in Norse mythology. Where other creatures were bound to specific forms or limited to particular environments, the Draugr could become whatever shape best suited its immediate needs and could scale itself to match any tactical requirement. It could be the bull on the hillside, the seal in the water, the mist seeping through your defenses, the giant filling your hall, or the impossibly compressed horror pursuing you through spaces meant to be refuges. Every confrontation was unique because the creature itself refused to be predictable or limited by any single form. This mastery of transformation also meant that traditional combat strategies often failed completely. You could not simply outrun a creature that might transform into something faster. You could not hide in spaces too small for it to follow. You could not use the environment to your advantage because the Draugr would simply change its form to match the terrain. Every natural advantage a human fighter might hope to exploit, the Draugr could neutralize through transformation. This is why the sagas emphasize that defeating a Draugr required not just courage and strength, but cunning, determination, and often a willingness to employ supernatural countermeasures or ritual solutions rather than relying on mundane weapons alone. As we move forward in our exploration of these creatures, as we delve into their other powers and examine specific encounters from the sagas, remember this fundamental truth. The Draugr was a hunter of supreme capability, able to adapt its form to any situation, to become large or small, human or animal, solid or ethereal as circumstance demanded. It was predator perfected, death given not just animation, but flexibility and intelligence to direct that flexibility toward maximum lethality. Against such a creature, survival required either extraordinary heroism or the knowledge of the very specific methods needed to destroy it permanently. Methods we will explore in detail as this journey into Norse darkness continues. If the Draugr possessed only physical power, only its grotesque strength and shape-shifting abilities, it would still rank among the most formidable threats in Norse mythology. But the sagas describe capabilities that extend far beyond the merely corporeal. Powers that allowed these undead warriors to reach into realms that even their superhuman strength could not touch directly. The Draugr commanded the very elements themselves, bending weather to their malevolent will, and more terrifyingly still, they could invade the one sanctuary that should have remained inviolate. The realm of sleep and dreams, turning rest into a weapon and the sleeping mind into a battlefield. The control of weather was not a subtle ability for the Draugr, but rather a manifestation of raw, destructive power unleashed upon the natural world. When these creatures desired to strike at communities beyond the immediate reach of their burial mounds, when they sought to punish entire settlements or to prevent escape by sea, they summoned storms. These were not ordinary tempests, born of atmospheric conditions and seasonal patterns. They were supernatural maelstroms called into being by will alone, weather weaponized and directed with the same precision a warrior might aim a spear. Imagine a clear morning on the Icelandic coast. Fishermen prepare their boats, reading the sky with the expertise of men whose lives depend on understanding weather patterns. The horizon is clear, the wind favorable, every natural sign promising safe passage. They set out, their vessels laden with the day's catch or trade goods bound for distant settlements. Hours from shore, with land reduced to a dim line behind them, the sky begins to change. Clouds appear from nowhere, boiling up from a clear horizon with impossible speed. The wind shifts, coming now from multiple directions at once, creating confused seas that no natural storm produces. Lightning splits the darkening sky in patterns too regular to be coincidental, striking at the water around the boats as if seeking specific targets. The fishermen, if they are experienced with such things, recognize what is happening. This is not weather born of, but a storm called by something that hates the living. A Draugr, disturbed in its mound by grave robbers, or offended by descendants who failed to honor its memory, has reached out with supernatural power to punish any who sail these waters. The waves grow to monstrous heights, each one threatening to capsize vessels that have weathered countless natural storms. The wind howls with a sound that is almost vocal, almost like laughter or cursing. The temperature drops precipitously, frost forming on ropes and sails despite the season. This is weather as vengeance, the elements themselves conscripted into service by undead malice. The coastal settlements of medieval Scandinavia lived in constant awareness that the sea was both provider and destroyer. Storms could wipe out entire fishing fleets, leave communities starving through the winter, or drive ships onto rocks where they shattered like dropped pottery. The belief that Draugr could summon such destruction at will added a supernatural dimension to an already dangerous relationship with the ocean. Any unusual storm, any tempest that struck with particular ferocity or arose from seemingly calm conditions, might be attributed to the anger of the undead. This belief forced communities to be extraordinarily careful about respecting burial mounds near the coast, aware that disturbing the wrong grave could result in destruction. Visited not just upon the foolish tomb robber, but upon every sailor who dared the waters. The ability to create storms was not limited to maritime assault. Draugr could summon blizzards that buried settlements in snow, making travel impossible and isolating communities from any hope of aid or reinforcement. They could call forth fog so dense that it became disorienting and dangerous, a gray blindness that swallowed the landscape and left travelers wandering in circles until they died of exposure or walked into bogs and crevasses. They could generate winds so powerful they tore roofs from halls, scattered livestock across miles of countryside, and made the simple act of walking outdoors a life-threatening endeavor. The weather itself became an extension of the Draugr's reach, allowing a single undead warrior to project power across distances that its physical form, however enhanced, could never traverse. Some accounts describe an even more unsettling weather manipulation. the creation of darkness during daylight hours. In the long summer days of the far north, where the sun barely sets or does not set at all, light was a constant companion and comfort. For a Draugr to summon darkness in the middle of that eternal day, to blot out the sun itself and plunge the world into premature night, was a demonstration of power that bordered on the apocalyptic. Warriors who faced such darkness reported that it was not merely the absence of light, but an active, oppressive presence, a blackness that seemed to have weight and texture. Torches and fires burned dimly within it, their light unable to penetrate more than a few feet. Sound became muffled and directions confused. The darkness was a domain where the Draugr held every advantage, and the living stumbled blind and helpless. But if the control of weather represented the Draugr's ability to assault the physical world from a distance, its power to invade dreams struck at something even more fundamental: the sanctity of the mind itself. Sleep should be refuge, a time when the body rests and the consciousness retreats into private visions inaccessible to external threat. The Draugr violated this sanctuary with calculated cruelty, entering the dreams of the living to torment, terrify, and ultimately drive victims toward madness or death. The dream invasions began subtly. A person living near a Draugr's mound might experience unusually vivid nightmares, dreams of being chased through dark landscapes or of suffocating under enormous weight. These initial dreams were unpleasant, but not necessarily supernatural, easily dismissed as products of stress or indigestion. But the dreams would intensify night after night, becoming more specific, more personal. The dreamer would find themselves facing a figure they recognized from old stories or family histories, a dead warrior whose grave they knew lay in the nearby mound. The figure would speak, often threatening revenge for some real or perceived slight. It would promise suffering, describe in detail what it intended to do to the dreamer and their family. And night after night, sleep would transform from rest into ordeal. The truly horrifying aspect of these dream invasions was their tangible aftermath. The sagas emphasize repeatedly that Draugr would leave physical evidence of their nocturnal visits, gifts or marks that proved the encounters were not mere nightmares, but actual supernatural assaults. A person who dreamed of fighting the Draugr might wake to find bruises on their arms, exactly where the dream creature had gripped them. Someone who dreamed of being given a message or warning might discover an object from the burial mound placed beside their bed. A tarnished coin, a fragment of ancient weapon, a piece of corroded jewelry. These tokens served a dual purpose, proving the reality of the dream invasion, while also acting as cursed objects that ensured the victim could not dismiss the experience as imagination. The psychological warfare implicit in this ability cannot be overstated. Sleep became dangerous, something to be feared rather than sought. Victims would try to stay awake, knowing that closing their eyes meant returning to the Draugr's domain. But exhaustion inevitably won, and each time they fell asleep, the creature was waiting, its presence in their dreams growing more solid, more threatening, more real. The line between sleeping and waking began to blur. Victims reported seeing the Draugr in peripheral vision while awake, or hearing its voice when alone. Whether these were hallucinations born of sleep deprivation and psychological trauma, or actual manifestations of the creature's power expanding beyond dreams into waking reality, the effect was the same: a progressive descent into terror-induced madness. In some accounts, the dream invasions served specific purposes beyond simple torment. A Draugr seeking information about the location of someone it wanted to kill might invade dreams to learn their whereabouts. One attempting to drive an entire community away from its burial site might visit multiple people simultaneously, creating an atmosphere of collective nightmare that made continued habitation unbearable. The Draugr's intelligence and retained personality meant that it used this dream invasion power strategically, as a tool to accomplish goals that physical assault alone could not achieve. It was psychological warfare conducted by a creature that understood fear intimately, having been human itself once and knowing exactly what terrors would prove most effective. The sagas also describe Draugr using their presence in dreams to issue curses, pronouncements of doom that would take effect in the waking world. The most famous example appears in Grettis saga, where the Draugr Glámr curses the hero Grettir during their confrontation, condemning him to weakness and fear of darkness. But such curses could also be delivered through dreams, the Draugr speaking words in the sleeping mind that would bind the victim to specific fates, decreasing strength, increasing bad luck, vulnerability to disease, or simply the certainty of death at a specified time. Whether these curses operated through genuine supernatural force or through the psychological impact of believing oneself cursed, the results were documented as devastatingly real. The combination of weather control and dream invasion created a threat matrix that extended far beyond what any physical monster could achieve. The Draugr did not need to leave its mound to destroy you. It could drown you at sea with a summoned storm. It could freeze your livestock with an unnatural blizzard. It could shatter your sanity through nightly dream assaults. It could curse you to wasting death without ever physically touching you. These powers transformed the Draugr from a localized threat, dangerous primarily to grave robbers and those who ventured too near its burial site, into something that could project malevolent influence across entire regions, making every sleep potentially deadly and every voyage potentially doomed. Against such capabilities, walls and weapons offered little protection. The battle against a Draugr was not simply a matter of martial prowess, but required understanding of the creature's full range of abilities and the knowledge of how to counter supernatural threats that operated as much in the realm of mind and weather as in physical combat. The Draugr possesses all these terrifying powers, these abilities to change form and summon storms and invade dreams. But what drives it to use them? What motivates a creature that has already died, that exists in a state beyond life's normal desires and needs? The answer lies in the same obsessions that prevented the warrior from moving on in the first place. Greed for treasure, burning vengeance against enemies, and a possessive territoriality that transforms the burial mound from tomb into fortress. Understanding the Draugr's psychology and behavior reveals a creature that is achingly human in its motivations, even while being utterly inhuman in its methods and capabilities. Greed dominates the majority of Draugr. These were warriors who amassed wealth through a lifetime of raiding, trading, and conquest, men who measured their worth in arm rings and hoarded coins. When they were buried with this treasure, surrounded by the tangible proof of their success and status, they could not let it go. Death meant nothing compared to the importance of keeping what was theirs. The gold became an anchor, a focal point for consciousness that should have departed but instead remained, fusing with the corpse and transforming the dead warrior into an eternal guardian of wealth he could no longer spend but refused to surrender. This treasure lust manifests as savage territoriality. The Draugr does not wander far from its mound in most cases, not because it cannot, but because leaving means abandoning its hoard to potential thieves. It waits within the burial chamber with infinite patience, surrounded by its gold and weapons, listening for the sounds of intrusion. Every scrape of stone being moved, every whispered conversation of grave robbers planning their theft, every footstep approaching the mound registers with crystalline clarity. The Draugr knows its domain intimately. Every stone in the walls, every inch of the chamber, every possible approach. When intruders finally break through, they enter not just a tomb, but a killing ground where the Guardian holds every tactical advantage. The attack, when it comes, is brutal and efficient. The Draugr does not hesitate or offer warnings. Grave robbers who breach the mound's entrance find themselves facing a creature that explodes into violence. With the speed and skill of the warrior it once was, now enhanced by supernatural strength and freed from any physical limitations. The first blow often kills, a sword swing or axe strike delivered with force sufficient to cleave through shield and armor and the body beneath. Those who survive the initial assault face an enemy that cannot be easily wounded, that feels no pain, that fights with tactics learned through years of battle experience, retained perfectly in undead memory. The sagas describe these confrontations with visceral detail. Men are thrown against the stone walls of the burial chamber with force that breaks bones. Shields shatter under the Draugr's blows like rotten wood. Swords that connect with the creature's flesh penetrate only shallowly, the altered tissue resisting damage that would kill any living opponent. The confined space of the mound works entirely in the Draugr's favor, limiting the ability of multiple attackers to surround it, while giving the creature opportunities to use its size-changing abilities to fill the chamber, crushing intruders against the walls through sheer expanding bulk. But physical violence is not the Draugr's only weapon against those who threaten its treasure. These creatures retain the capacity for curse working, for speaking words of power that bind victims to specific dooms. A thief who escapes the mound with stolen gold might find himself cursed to weakness, his strength draining away over days or weeks until he cannot lift a sword or even stand. Another might be cursed with escalating bad luck, a series of misfortunes that seem coincidental at first, but build to a crescendo of disaster. The curse might target the thief's descendants, ensuring that generations pay for the ancestors' greed. The Draugr's intelligence allows it to craft punishments that fit the crime, using supernatural means to exact revenge that extends far beyond what physical assault alone could achieve. The impact of a Draugr extends beyond its immediate victims to affect entire communities unlucky enough to exist near its mound. When a Draugr becomes active, when it is disturbed or angered, or simply malevolent enough to seek targets beyond grave robbers, it brings blight to the surrounding land. Livestock begin to sicken and die without apparent cause, cattle falling in their fields or horses going mad in their stables. The milk spoils in the udder, grain rots in the storehouse, and fish avoid the nearby waters as if sensing the corruption. This agricultural and pastoral disaster can devastate subsistence communities, threatening starvation and forcing people to abandon settlements their families have occupied for generations. The disease spreads from animals to humans in many accounts. A mysterious illness sweeps through the community, characterized by wasting, weakness, and a peculiar lethargy that seems to drain the will to resist. People sicken and die despite the best efforts of healers. Children are particularly vulnerable, their smaller bodies unable to withstand whatever supernatural plague the Draugr has unleashed. The illness defies normal treatment because it is not natural disease, but supernatural curse, requiring ritual solutions and often the permanent destruction of the Draugr itself before the community can recover. Perhaps most horrifying is the Draugr's ability to create more of its own kind through a form of supernatural infection. The method is specific and consistently described across multiple sagas. Strangulation. The Draugr seeks out victims in the night, entering homes with a stealth its powers granted or waiting for solitary travelers who pass too near its territory. It attacks from behind or from above, massive hands closing around the victim's throat with crushing pressure. The struggle is brief and futile against such strength. The victim dies, strangled and broken, and is left where they fell. But death is not the end for these victims. The Draugr's touch, the manner of death, or perhaps some supernatural contagion transferred during the strangulation causes the corpse to rise in turn. The newly created Draugr possesses fewer powers than the original, often unable to shapeshift or control weather. But it retains the essential characteristics: supernatural strength, territorial aggression, and the compulsion to strangle the living. Thus begins a cycle of undead proliferation, where one Draugr spawns others, and those spawn more, until entire regions become infested with these creatures and depopulated of the living who flee or die. The psychology driving this behavior reveals a creature motivated by deeply human emotions, amplified and corrupted by its undead state. Greed becomes not mere attachment to wealth, but an all-consuming obsession that defines existence. A living miser might eventually be persuaded to part with some treasure, or might die and release his hold on material goods. The Draugr never releases, never compromises, never forgets that the gold is his, and that anyone seeking it deserves death. This single-minded focus makes negotiation impossible and ensures that every encounter with treasure-hunting humans ends in violence. Vengeance operates similarly, becoming a motivation that transcends reason or proportionality. A warrior who died with enemies still living might rise as a Draugr to hunt them down. But the revenge does not end with killing those specific individuals. It extends to their families, their descendants, anyone associated with them. The Draugr remembers slights from life with perfect clarity, nursing grudges across years or decades, waiting for opportunities to strike at those who wronged it. This patient malevolence, combined with the creature's supernatural abilities and immunity to time's erosive effects on memory and motivation, makes the Draugr an implacable enemy that will pursue vengeance literally forever unless destroyed by the specific methods required to end its existence. Some Draugr seem motivated by nothing more complex than hatred of the living itself. These are often men who died bitter and angry, who resented their own mortality and the continuation of life around them. Their undead state becomes an opportunity to inflict their misery on others, to spread death and suffering simply because they can. These creatures are perhaps the most dangerous because they are not confined to defending a specific mound or pursuing particular enemies. They roam more widely, attacking randomly, creating maximum chaos and fear without the constraints of even corrupted rationality. The behavioral patterns of Draugr reveal consistent elements across the sagas. They prefer to operate at night, though they are not destroyed or even weakened by daylight, like some revenants. The darkness simply offers tactical advantages, allowing them to approach settlements unseen and to leverage the fear that night naturally inspires in human psychology. They demonstrate strategic thinking, setting ambushes and using the terrain to their advantage. They learn from encounters, becoming more dangerous with each failed attempt to destroy them as they understand their opponent's tactics and capabilities. This learning capacity, this retention of intelligence and ability to adapt, makes the Draugr a threat that grows more formidable the longer it exists. Yet for all their power and malevolence, Draugr remain bound by certain limitations and patterns. Most cannot or will not travel far from their burial mounds, their attachment to treasure keeping them localized. They can be predicted to some extent, their behaviors following consistent patterns that clever opponents can anticipate and counter. And crucially, they can be destroyed, though the methods required are specific and demanding. Understanding the Draugr's psychology, its motivations and behaviors, is essential preparation for confronting one. knowledge that can mean the difference between being merely another victim strangled in the darkness and being the hero who ends the undead terror permanently. The Draugr is a guardian of cursed gold, a creature of vengeance and greed, and a plague upon the living. But it is not invincible. It can be defeated, as we shall see in the specific accounts of those who faced these monsters and lived to have their deeds recorded in the sagas. Among all the Draugr encounters preserved in the Icelandic sagas, none is more detailed, more terrifying, or more consequential than the tale of Glámr the shepherd. His story, recorded in Grettis saga with the precision of historical chronicle, demonstrates every aspect of Draugr horror we have explored. The grotesque transformation, the supernatural powers, the retained malevolence, and the near impossibility of destruction. But it adds something more, a curse so profound that it shapes the destiny of one of Iceland's greatest heroes and reveals the true cost of confronting these undead warriors, even in victory. The tale begins not with monsters, but with a problem familiar to any farming community: the need for reliable labor. Thorstein, a prosperous farmer in the Vatnsdalur Valley of northern Iceland, found himself in desperate need of a shepherd. The position was difficult and dangerous, even in the best of circumstances, requiring a man to tend flocks in isolated areas, to work through harsh weather, and to remain alone for extended periods in landscape where threats both natural and supernatural were constant companions. Several shepherds had already tried and failed, fleeing the job or meeting mysterious ends that Thorstein's household whispered about, but did not fully explain. Into this situation came Glámr, a man whose physical size and apparent fearlessness made him seem perfect for the role. He was a Swede, a foreigner in Iceland, a man of enormous stature and strength who feared neither isolation nor hardship. But Glámr possessed qualities that should have warned anyone paying attention. A temperament so foul that he alienated everyone he met. A contempt for the Christian faith that was spreading through Iceland. And an arrogance that bordered on blasphemy. When warned about the supernatural dangers associated with the shepherd's position, dangers that had driven off or destroyed his predecessors, Glámr laughed. He did not believe in ghosts or trolls or any of the beings that the Icelanders treated with wary respect. The winter arrived early and harsh that year, the kind of season where darkness dominates and cold becomes a physical presence that seeps through walls and steals warmth from bodies huddled near fires. Glámr performed his duties with competent efficiency, tending the sheep even in the worst weather, showing the physical resilience that his size promised. But his personality did not improve with familiarity. He refused to fast on holy days as Christian custom demanded, mocking those who observed such restrictions. His presence in Thorstein's household was tolerated only because he was effective at his work, keeping the flock safe when others had failed. Christmas Eve arrived, a night of particular significance in the blended pagan Christian culture of medieval Iceland. On this night, the boundary between worlds grew thin, and supernatural dangers reached their peak. Thorstein's wife warned Glámr explicitly to remain at the farmstead, to not venture out to check on the sheep no matter what sounds he might hear or what concerns he might have. Her warning carried the weight of genuine knowledge, passed down through generations about what walked abroad on such nights. Glámr ignored her completely, displaying the same contempt for local wisdom that had characterized his entire tenure. He left the farmstead as darkness fell, disappearing into the winter night with his usual arrogant confidence. He did not return that night, nor the next morning. When search parties finally went out, following tracks through the snow, they found a scene of devastation. The sheep were scattered and terrified, many dead or injured. The trail of Glámr's passage told a story of pursuit and combat, of something hunting the shepherd through the darkness. His body was discovered in a remote valley, and the sight of it drove men to immediate horror. Glámr's massive frame was broken, his neck twisted at an impossible angle, his face frozen in an expression of such terror that witnesses could barely look at it. Whatever had killed him, some supernatural entity drawn by his blasphemous disregard for sacred nights, had done so with casual brutality. They carried the corpse back toward the church for Christian burial, but Glámr's body demonstrated an immediate and ominous resistance. The weight became unbearable, forcing the bearers to stop repeatedly despite the relatively short distance. When they finally abandoned the effort and left the body in a temporary location, intending to return with more help, the situation deteriorated further. That very night, Glámr rose. The shepherd who had not believed in supernatural threats became one, transformed by whatever killed him and by his own malevolent into a Draugr of terrible power. The haunting began immediately and escalated with each passing night. Glámr's Draugr returned to Thorstein's farmstead, the place he had lived and worked, drawn by some combination of territorial attachment and active malice. He climbed onto the roof of the main hall, creating such noise that sleep became impossible. Thundering footsteps and scraping sounds that went on for hours. When anyone was brave or foolish enough to venture outside, they would catch glimpses of the creature. A figure even larger than Glámr had been in life, moving with unnatural speed, its eyes gleaming with that characteristic cold light. The stench preceded each appearance, announcing the Draugr's presence before it could be seen. People began dying. Some were found outside in the morning, their bodies showing the marks of strangulation or simply dead from exposure after fleeing the hall in terror during the night. Others sickened and wasted away, victims of the supernatural illness that Draugr brought with them. Livestock died in their pens or went mad with fear, smelling the corruption that approached. The farm, once prosperous, it descended into nightmare as winter deepened and Glámr's attacks continued without respite. Families began abandoning the area, unwilling to remain near a Draugr that showed no signs of limiting its malevolence or returning to its grave. This was the situation when Grettir Asmundarsson arrived, drawn by reports of the haunting and motivated by the hero's complex mixture of pride, duty, and desire for fame. Grettir was already legendary, a man of exceptional strength and courage who had faced numerous dangers, both human and supernatural. But he had never encountered anything like Glámr's Draugr, and the confrontation that followed would mark him for the remainder of his life. He came to Thorstein's farm as winter reached its darkest point, the season when nights stretched longest and the sun barely troubled the horizon. Grettir prepared carefully, recognizing that this was no ordinary opponent. He positioned himself in the main hall, waiting as darkness fell and the household huddled in far corners, terrified of what the night would bring. The wait was lengthy, tension building as hours passed in silence. Then came the familiar sounds, heavy footsteps on the roof, the scraping and pounding that announced Glámr's presence. But this time, instead of tormenting from above, the Draugr descended. The door, barred and reinforced, shattered under supernatural strength. Glámr entered the hall, and even Grettir, fearless hero that he was, felt his courage waver at the sight. The creature was immense, far larger than the already huge man Glámr had been in life. The flesh had taken on that characteristic blue-black corruption, and the eyes burned with cold malevolence. The Draugr's attention fixed on Grettir immediately, recognizing that here was a genuine threat rather than ordinary farmers cowering in fear. What followed was a battle of titanic proportion. Strength against strength. Living warrior against undead monster. They grappled in the hall, crashes and impacts shaking the building's foundation. Furniture shattered beneath their struggle. Walls cracked under the force of bodies slammed against them. Grettir held his own through sheer determination and superior technique. But he could not gain decisive advantage. The Draugr felt no pain, no fatigue, no weakness from injuries that would have incapacitated any living opponent. The fight continued, destructive and terrible, until Glámr attempted to drag Grettir outside. The hero recognized the danger, understanding that once outside, the creature would have even greater advantage. With desperate strength, Grettir managed to reverse their positions, forcing the Draugr toward the doorway. In a final violent effort, he threw Glámr backward through the broken door. What happened next determined Grettir's fate as surely as any curse deliberately spoken. The moon broke through the clouds at that exact moment, illuminating the scene with pale light. Glámr's eyes locked with Grettir's, and in that instant of connection, the Draugr spoke. His voice emerged as something between words and the scraping of stone on stone, and what he said was prophecy and curse combined. He told Grettir that his strength would never increase beyond what it was at that moment, that bad luck would follow him, and most devastating of all, that he would forever fear darkness and being alone. The eyes themselves, glowing with supernatural malevolence, seemed to burn this curse directly into Grettir's mind. With immense effort and the advantage of surprise granted by moonlight, Grettir managed to behead the Draugr. But even this was not sufficient. Following the traditional methods for destroying such creatures, the body was burned and the ashes scattered, ensuring that Glámr could not return. The haunting ended. The farm slowly recovered, and Grettir was celebrated as the hero who had accomplished what others could not. Yet the victory was hollow, for Glámr's curse proved devastatingly real. From that night forward, Grettir, who had been fearless, found himself unable to bear darkness or solitude. His strength never increased, and bad luck plagued his endeavors until he died years later as an outlaw, isolated and afraid, his fate sealed by the dying words of a creature he had destroyed. The saga of Glámr demonstrates the ultimate truth about confronting Draugr. Even in victory, these monsters exact terrible prices from those who dare to stand against them. The tale of Glámr represents perhaps the most famous Draugr encounter in Norse literature, but it is far from the only one. The Icelandic sagas preserve numerous accounts of these undead warriors, each story adding details and variations that together create a comprehensive portrait of the phenomenon. Among these accounts, the tale of Þorbjörn recorded in Eyrbyggja saga stands out for its demonstration of how a single Draugr could spawn a wave of undead terror that threatened to consume an entire community, illustrating the infectious of the curse and the desperate measures required to stop its spread. Þorbjörn was a man of standing in his community, respected and prosperous, whose death should have been unremarkable except for one fatal detail. He drowned at sea during a fishing expedition. His body was recovered and brought back to his home at Froda for proper burial. But something about the manner of his death, or perhaps some aspect of his character that had remained hidden during life, created the conditions for his return. The funeral was conducted according to custom, the body prepared and interred, and the household attempted to return to normal rhythms of life. But Þorbjörn had not finished with the world of the living. The haunting began with subtle manifestations that escalated with terrifying speed. Þorbjörn appeared in the hall at night, soaking wet as if fresh from the sea, water dripping from his clothes to pool on the floor where he stood. His presence brought the smell of salt and rot, and his eyes held that characteristic cold gleam that marked the Draugr. Unlike Glámr, who had been violent from the first night of his haunting, Þorbjörn seemed almost plaintive initially, as if seeking something from the living or trying to communicate some need or grievance. But when his silent vigils received no satisfactory response, his behavior turned malevolent. The deaths started soon after, following the pattern documented in other Draugr accounts. People in the household began dying in their sleep, strangled or simply expiring without obvious cause. Each victim rose in turn, creating additional undead that joined Þorbjörn in haunting the settlement. The sagas describe this proliferation with chilling matter-of-factness. One death led to another, which led to several more, until the household found itself overrun with Draugr of varying power and malevolence. Some retained intelligence and specific motivations, while others seemed to be little more than animated corpses driven by base aggression, but all contributed to an atmosphere of escalating terror. What makes the Eyrbyggja saga account particularly valuable is its detailed description of the methods used to combat this infestation. The community recognized that conventional approaches were failing, that simply trying to defend against the nightly attacks was unsustainable. They needed to address the root cause and permanently eliminate the threat. A formal legal proceeding was convened, a door court held according to proper procedure, where the Draugr were officially charged with trespassing and causing harm. This combination of legal ritual and supernatural countermeasure reflected the Norse understanding that the undead, despite their power, still fell under certain laws and could be bound by properly executed procedures. Following the legal declaration, the bodies of Þorbjörn and those who had risen after him were exhumed. Each corpse was examined, and the transformation that death had wrought was documented with the same precision applied to property disputes or genealogies. The bodies were then burned, completely and thoroughly, with the ashes scattered or buried in locations where they could not recongregate or take root. The hall itself was purified through ritual and physical cleansing, every trace of the haunting systematically eliminated. Only through this comprehensive approach did the community finally achieve relief from the plague of undead that had nearly destroyed them. The Þorbjörn account illustrates several key aspects of Draugr behavior that appear consistently across multiple sagas. First, the manner of death matters. Those who die by drowning, those who die alone or in circumstances that prevent proper immediate burial, those whose bodies are somehow mistreated or inadequately prepared, all seem more likely to rise as Draugr. Second, the creation of additional undead through strangulation or proximity to the original Draugr creates exponential threat, transforming a single supernatural problem into a community-wide catastrophe. Third, legal and ritual procedures, properly executed, possess genuine power against these creatures, suggesting that the Norse understood the Draugr as existing within a framework of cosmic law rather than outside all rules and constraints. But not all the restless dead were Draugr in the full sense of the term. The sagas also describe a related but distinct type of undead known as the Haugbúi, or mound dweller. These beings shared some characteristics with Draugr, including the retention of consciousness after death and the ability to physically manifest, but differed in crucial ways. The Haugbúi typically remained within their burial mounds, not venturing out to attack settlements or pursue vengeance. Their interaction with the living was defensive rather than aggressive, limited to protecting their graves from disturbance rather than actively seeking victims. The distinction between Draugr and Haugbúi is subtle but significant. A haugbui might allow respectful visitors to approach its mound or even communicate with those who came seeking wisdom or permission. Some accounts describe haugbuai as being almost reasonable, capable of negotiation and willing to allow certain intrusions if proper respect was shown. The Draugr, by contrast, was implacably hostile, attacking anything living that came within reach and pursuing feuds with single-minded determination. Where the haugbuai represented the dead, maintaining a presence in their resting place, the Draugr represented the dead refusing to rest at all, driven by obsessions that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Other saga accounts add further variations to the Draugr phenomenon. Some describe Draugr who possessed prophetic abilities, who could see the future or know things happening at great distances. These creatures would sometimes issue warnings or prophecies to those they encountered, speaking of events yet to come with unsettling accuracy. Whether this represented genuine supernatural knowledge or simply the perspective of a being existing partially outside normal time remains unclear, but the consistency of such accounts across multiple independent sagas suggests the trait was considered a genuine aspect of Draugr. Certain Draugr demonstrated affinities for specific environments or elements. Those who died at sea, like Þorbjörn, often maintained connections to water, appearing soaking wet regardless of weather conditions or manifesting during storms. Draugr, who had been shepherds or farmers in life, sometimes focused their malevolence on livestock and crops, destroying the agricultural foundations of communities rather than directly attacking people. Warriors who became Draugr retained their combat skills and tactical thinking, making them especially dangerous opponents who could not be defeated through simple, superior force, but required cunning and specific knowledge to overcome. The geographic distribution of Draugr accounts across Iceland and Scandinavia reveals patterns in the phenomenon. Coastal communities reported more incidents of Draugr associated with drowning or sea-related deaths. Inland settlements dealt with Draugr, who focused on protecting burial mounds and treasure. Areas with histories of feuds and violence saw more Draugr motivated by vengeance rather than greed. This regional variation suggests that local conditions, both physical and social, influence the specific manifestations of the undead. That the Draugr was not a single uniform threat, but rather adapted to or reflected the particular fears and circumstances of each community. The sagas also preserve accounts of failed attempts to destroy Draugr, cautionary tales of heroes who tried conventional methods and paid with their lives. These stories emphasize repeatedly that normal combat, however bravely conducted, was insufficient. A Draugr could not be killed in the sense that a living opponent could be killed because it was already dead. Wounds that would end any mortal fight merely inconvenienced the Draugr. Exhaustion, a key factor in any prolonged combat, did not affect creatures that no longer needed rest. Only specific methods worked. Decapitation, followed by burning, followed by dispersal of ashes. Or in some cases, elaborate ritual procedures that bound the creature through supernatural means. Some accounts mention Draugr being temporarily subdued through wrestling or being pinned beneath heavy stones. But these measures provided only brief respite. The creatures would eventually free themselves or find other ways to manifest their malevolence. Permanent destruction required permanent solutions, and the knowledge of what those solutions were became precious information passed down through generations, preserved in the sagas not as entertainment, but as practical instruction for dealing with a genuine threat. The variety of Draugr encounters preserved in the sagas demonstrates that medieval Norse communities took these phenomena seriously and systematically. They observed patterns, documented specific cases with detailed precision, experimented with different countermeasures, and recorded what worked and what failed. The resulting body of literature represents not folklore in the dismissive modern sense, but rather a comprehensive attempt to understand and cope with what the culture perceived as real supernatural dangers. Whether the Draugr were objectively real in any sense we would recognize today matters less than understanding that the Norse believed they were real and developed sophisticated responses to the threat they represented. The saga of Þorbjörn and the many other Draugr accounts preserved in Icelandic literature stand as testament to a culture's confrontation with death's refusal to remain final. With the terrifying possibility that some warriors were simply too stubborn, too greedy, or too angry to let go of life, even after their bodies had failed them. The Draugr is formidable, possessing strength that exceeds any living warrior, powers that bend reality to malevolent will, and resilience that makes conventional combat futile. Yet despite all these advantages, despite the supernatural force that animates dead flesh and grants it terrible capabilities, the Draugr is not invincible. The Norse people, through generations of grim experience and desperate experimentation, developed specific methods for destroying these creatures permanently. But understanding these methods requires recognizing a fundamental truth. The Draugr cannot be killed in any conventional sense because it is already dead. It must be unmade, destroyed so thoroughly that no fragment of its corrupted existence can reconstitute or return. The first and most crucial lesson learned through bitter experience was that simple decapitation, though a dramatic gesture in any confrontation with the undead, was insufficient on its own. Warriors who managed to sever a Draugr's head discovered to their horror that the creature did not cease its attacks. The body would continue fighting, groping blindly, but still dangerously strong. The severed head might snap its jaws or speak curses even when separated from the torso. Accounts exist of Draugr heads being placed between the legs of their own bodies during burial preparations, a gruesome precaution meant to prevent reassembly. Yet even this proved inadequate in some cases. The Draugr's animation came from a source deeper than the physical connection between head and body. A supernatural force that could persist despite what should have been utterly fatal damage. The second step in the destruction process, fire, represented humanity's oldest weapon against things that should not exist. The Draugr's body, however altered by supernatural corruption, was still composed of flesh and bone, materials that fire could consume. But the burning had to be complete and thorough. Not a simple cremation, but rather an act of total annihilation. The corpse would be placed upon a massive pyre, constructed with enough fuel to burn hot and long, maintaining temperature sufficient to reduce even the dense, altered tissue of the Draugr to ash and fragments. Witnesses would remain throughout the entire burning, ensuring that the fire did not die prematurely, adding fuel as needed and watching for any sign that the creature retained animation even as flames consumed it. The process was not quick or clean. The Draugr's flesh, swollen with whatever force animated it, would sometimes burst in the heat, releasing fluids and gases that added their own fuel to the fire. The stench, already overwhelming when the creature lived, intensified to unbearable levels as burning flesh mixed with the corruption within. Those tasked with maintaining the pyre would tie cloth over their faces, stand upwind when possible, and steel themselves against the sounds that sometimes emerged from the burning corpse. Noises that could be interpreted as screams or curses or simply the result of air escaping from superheated tissues. The burning continued until nothing remained but ash and small fragments of bone, material that bore no resemblance to the monster that had terrorized the community. But even this was not sufficient for final destruction. The ashes themselves retained some echo of the Draugr's, some residual connection to the consciousness that had refused to depart. If left in one place, If allowed to remain on land, where roots could touch them or animals could disturb them, the possibility existed for some form of return or continued influence. The solution, documented repeatedly across the sagas, was dispersal in a manner that prevented any possibility of reconstitution. The most common and most effective method was scattering the ashes at sea, casting them into deep water far from shore where currents would carry them in multiple directions, where the vastness of the ocean would ensure that no fragment could find its way back to land or gather with other fragments. The choice of the sea was not arbitrary. Norse cosmology understood water, particularly the ocean, as a liminal space of immense power, a boundary between worlds that possessed its own cleansing and binding properties. What was cast into the deep sea entered a realm beyond the normal geography of the living, a space where the laws governing land and burial and the connection between body and place no longer applied with the same force. The ashes, once scattered in salt water, lost whatever anchoring power they possessed. The Draugr could not return from such dispersal because there was no single location to return to, no focal point for the obsessive attachment that had animated the corpse in the first place. Alternative methods existed for communities located far from the sea, or when circumstances made sea burial impractical. The ashes might be buried at a crossroads, a location that disrupted directional connection and prevented the dead from finding their way back to their former territory. They might be scattered across running water, streams or rivers whose constant flow would carry the remains in ever-changing patterns. Some accounts describe ashes being buried beneath large stones or at the foundations of buildings, places where the weight of the living world pressed down upon them and prevented any upward movement. But these methods were considered less certain than sea dispersal, acceptable in necessity, but not preferred when ocean access was available. The complete ritual, from initial combat through decapitation, burning, and final dispersal, required significant resources and community cooperation. A single individual, no matter how heroic, could defeat a Draugr in combat, but could not complete the destruction alone. The pyre needed construction and constant attention. The ashes needed collection and transport. Witnesses were required to verify each step, to ensure nothing was missed or abbreviated. This communal aspect of Draugr destruction reflected the Norse understanding that the undead threat affected entire communities, and therefore required collective response. The hero might strike the killing blow, but the people finished the task. Prevention, the Norse understood, was vastly preferable to cure. When burying someone at risk of becoming a Draugr, specific precautions could be taken that would either prevent the rising or at least make the subsequent destruction easier. The corpse might be positioned face down so that if it did animate, it would dig deeper into the earth rather than upward toward the surface. Heavy stones could be placed upon the grave, not just as markers, but as physical barriers requiring supernatural strength to displace. In some traditions, needles or nails were driven through the feet of the corpse, symbolically and perhaps literally pinning it in place. These preventative measures recognized that some individuals, by virtue of their character, their manner of death, or their attachment to worldly things, carried higher risk of undead return. Legal and ritual procedures also played roles in combating Draugr, as demonstrated in accounts like that of Þorbjörn from Eyrbyggja saga. Door courts, formal legal proceedings conducted according to proper procedure, could be held to charge the undead with trespassing and causing harm. These proceedings were not mere theater, but represented the Norse belief that even supernatural entities existed within frameworks of law and obligation. By formally declaring the Draugr to be in violation of community rules, by using the power of collective witness and proper legal formula, communities could bind or weaken the creature, making subsequent physical destruction more feasible. The combination of legal action and physical violence reflected a sophisticated understanding that different types of power, social and supernatural, material and procedural, could be brought to bear against threats that transcended normal categories. In some desperate cases, communities abandoned settlements entirely rather than continue fighting Draugr that proved impossible to destroy. Farmsteads were left empty, halls were deliberately burned, and entire populations relocated to areas beyond the creature's apparent range. This represented the ultimate admission of defeat, acknowledgement that sometimes the cost of remaining and fighting exceeded the value of the land itself. But even these abandoned places were marked and remembered. Warnings passed down to future generations about locations that remained cursed, where the old dead still walked and where the unwary might encounter horrors that should have been destroyed centuries before. The knowledge of how to properly destroy a Draugr was precious information, preserved in the sagas not as entertainment, but as practical instruction for communities that might face such threats. The specificity of the methods, the insistence on complete burning followed by sea dispersal, the warnings about what happened when shortcuts were taken, all point to a culture that took these procedures seriously and understood their importance. Whether modern readers interpret the Draugr as literal undead warriors or as cultural metaphors for deeper fears about death, greed, and the failure to let go, the destruction rituals preserved in Norse literature represent humanity's refusal to accept that any terror, however powerful, must be endured forever. Every monster, the sagas insist, has its weakness. Every curse can be ended, but only if you know the methods, possess the courage to employ them, and have the community support necessary to see the grim work through to its final, absolute conclusion. The Draugr was formidable, but it was not eternal. Fire and water, properly applied with unwavering determination, could end even the most stubborn refusal to accept death's finality. The Draugr did not die when the Viking Age ended. These creatures, preserved in the Icelandic sagas with documentary precision, have survived the centuries not as active supernatural threats, but as cultural memories that continue to evolve and adapt. From medieval manuscripts copied by Christian monks to modern video games played by millions worldwide, the Draugr has traversed an extraordinary journey, transforming along the way while retaining certain core elements that speak to something fundamental in human fear and fascination. Understanding this evolution reveals both what we have lost and what we have gained in our ongoing relationship with Norse mythology's most terrifying undead. The transition from oral tradition to written saga represented the Draugr's first major transformation. When the stories were finally recorded in the 12th and 13th centuries, several hundred years after the events they purported to describe, they were filtered through Christian sensibilities and literary conventions that had not existed in the original pagan context. Yet remarkably, the creatures remained largely intact in their essential characteristics. The bloated corpses, the glowing eyes, the retained intelligence and motivation, the specific methods required for destruction. The saga writers, many of them educated in monasteries, preserved these accounts with a fidelity that suggests they took the material seriously, recognizing cultural value and maintaining accurate transmission even when the beliefs themselves had changed. For centuries following their initial recording, the Draugr existed primarily in academic circles and among those Icelanders who maintained connection to their saga heritage. The creatures were subjects of scholarly study, analyzed for what they revealed about pre-Christian Norse beliefs and burial practices. They appeared in folklore collections assembled by 19th century antiquarians who recognized the value of preserving traditional stories before modernization erased them entirely. But they remained relatively obscure outside Scandinavia, overshadowed by more widely known mythological figures like Thor and Odin. creatures whose heroic aspects translated more easily into popular culture than the grim horror of the undead. The 20th century brought the Draugr into broader awareness through multiple channels. The rise of fantasy literature as a genre created appetite for mythological creatures beyond the standard European fairy tale repertoire. Authors seeking fresh material delved into Norse sources and discovered these remarkably detailed undead warriors. Early fantasy role-playing games incorporated Draugr as enemies, though often simplified or altered to fit game mechanics. These early adaptations began a process of transformation that would accelerate dramatically with the advent of digital gaming and the massive popularity of Norse-inspired fantasy settings. Then came Skyrim. Released in 2011, The Elder Scrolls V. Skyrim introduced the Draugr to millions of players worldwide, embedding these creatures into gaming consciousness with unprecedented impact. But the Draugr of Skyrim, while nominally based on Norse sources, represents a significant departure from the saga versions in ways both inevitable, given the medium, and revealing about modern expectations for undead enemies. The game's Draugr are numerous, appearing in seemingly every Nordic ruin the player explores. They rise from stone slabs or burst from coffins, attacking with ancient weapons and sometimes employing magical abilities. They serve as enemies scaled to provide appropriate challenge at various player levels, from relatively weak, basic Draugr to formidable death lords that can kill careless players with single blows. Yet, something crucial was lost in this translation from saga to game. The Skyrim Draugr, for all their atmospheric presentation and the excellent sound design that makes their rasping voices genuinely unsettling, lack the personality and motivation that defined their saga predecessors. They are generic enemies, indistinguishable from one another beyond combat statistics. They do not guard specific treasures with obsessive greed or pursue particular vendettas with implacable determination. They cannot shapeshift or control weather or invade dreams. Most importantly, they show no sign of the retained intelligence that made Saga Draugr so terrifying. That quality of being fully conscious undead who remembered their lives and chose their malevolence deliberately rather than acting from mindless compulsion. This simplification reflects the practical demands of game design, but also reveals something about contemporary undead fiction. Modern audiences, raised on zombie apocalypse narratives and countless variations on shambling corpses, expect their undead enemies to be numerous and relatively disposable. The idea of a single Draugr as a major antagonist, a creature so dangerous that an entire saga subplot might revolve around its destruction, does not translate easily into a medium where players expect to kill dozens of enemies in a typical dungeon crawl. The intimate horror of the saga Draugr, the personal of its hatred and the tragic waste of a warrior so consumed by greed or vengeance that death itself could not release him, becomes diluted when multiplied across hundreds of identical foes. Yet Skyrim and similar modern adaptations have accomplished something valuable despite these changes. They have introduced the concept of the Draugr to global audiences who might never have encountered Icelandic sagas, creating awareness and curiosity that sometimes leads people back to the original sources. Players who enjoyed fighting Draugr in the game have sought out the actual mythology, discovering Grettis saga and Eyrbyggja saga, and the rich complexity of Norse beliefs about death and the undead. This reverse journey from simplified game enemy to sophisticated cultural artifact represents a new kind of oral tradition, digital and global rather than local and verbal, but serving similar functions of transmission and preservation. Other modern media have engaged with the Draugr concept with varying degrees of fidelity to the sources. Fantasy novels sometimes feature these creatures, occasionally treating them with the complexity they deserve. presenting Draugr as intelligent antagonists with comprehensible, if twisted, motivations. Horror fiction has discovered the potential in undead that retain consciousness, that can think and plan and hate with fully human understanding. Some authors have explored the tragedy implicit in the Draugr concept, the existential horror of being trapped in a decaying corpse, unable to let go of life, yet incapable of truly living, driven by obsessions that have become meaningless except as anchors, preventing movement toward whatever lies beyond death. The contrast between the Draugr and the modern zombie illuminates what makes the Norse conception unique and why it deserves preservation in more than simplified form. The zombie apocalypse narrative that dominates contemporary horror presents undead as essentially natural disasters given rotting flesh, threats to be survived but not understood or reasoned with. Zombies are tragic in aggregate, representing the fall of civilization. But individually, they are empty vessels, deserving neither fear beyond the physical threat they pose nor any emotional engagement. The Draugr, by contrast, demands to be understood as an individual, as a person whose failure to transition properly through death has consequences both supernatural and deeply personal. This individuality, this retention of personality and purpose beyond death, makes the saga Draugr a more psychologically complex and ultimately more disturbing antagonist than any mindless zombie horde. When you face a Draugr in the original Norse conception, you face someone who has made terrible choices, who has valued gold or vengeance or mere existence more than the natural progression toward whatever afterlife awaited. You confront the possibility that attachment to worldly things might prove stronger than death, that personality might persist when it should dissolve, that some people might refuse the gift or curse of oblivion that death offers. These are existential questions that zombie fiction rarely addresses because its undead lack the consciousness necessary to make them relevant. As we stand here at the end of this exploration, having followed the Draugr from its burial mound through the sagas and into the digital realms of modern gaming, what should we take away from this journey? First, that folklore evolves but does not necessarily improve in the evolution, that something valuable can be lost when complex cultural beliefs are simplified for mass entertainment. Second, that the original sources remain accessible and rewarding for those willing to seek them out, that Grettis saga and its companion texts offer horror and insight that no adaptation has fully captured. Third, that the questions the Draugr embodies, questions about death and greed and the failure to release what must be released, remain as relevant now as they were when Vikings buried their warriors with gold and feared their return. The Draugr endures because it speaks to something permanent and human. The temptation to cling to life and possessions even when doing so becomes monstrous. The fear that we might become the very things we dread if we cannot let go gracefully. It survives in changed form because each generation finds new ways to express these ancient anxieties, new media to contain old terrors. From saga to Skyrim, from medieval Iceland to global gaming culture, the Draugr walks on, guardian of cursed gold and symbol of death's refusal to remain final. If this journey into the frozen heart of Norse mythology has captivated you, if you hunger for more explorations of the authentic folklore that inspired our modern fantasies, then join this community. Subscribe, enable notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments about which mythological terror we should examine next. The old stories are not dead, merely sleeping in their mounds, waiting for those brave or curious enough to break the seals and face what lies within. The Draugr has taught us that some things refuse to stay buried, that the past maintains its grip on the present, and that the most terrifying monsters are those that remember being human.